So how many here today have a smartphone? It's an almost universal phenomenon. Well, on a typical smartphone, you can find a little Christmas tree, a gift-wrapped box, and a Santa Claus. Like that. All are symbols of the Christmas season, tiny pictures used on social media, in text messages, and in email. And the name for them? How many of you have ever used an emoji? Well, now you know there are Advent and Christmas ones, right? So those are available for your consumption. Well, the prophet Jeremiah, he said, a righteous branch will spring up for Jesse's son, King David. And I think that branch is sort of a colorful symbol for the season of Advent. And all of us can picture that in our imagination, sort of deep black roots, sturdy brown branches, tender green shoots, a lot like what it says in the scripture. Isaiah said, a shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. We sing about that branch at Christmas time. Lo, how a rose ere blooming from tender stem has sprung, of Jesse's lineage coming, by faithful prophets sung. So I am going to posit that we could say the righteous branch is a great example of an emoji from God. Easy to see and beautiful to sing about. But then we have to ask, okay, but what in the world does it mean? And so as we begin this Advent season, we are all painfully aware of a growing sense of disillusionment in our society. Basic values are questioned. Optimism for the future is rare. Cynicism and pessimism abound. And there's this persistent skepticism that exists regarding personal, political, and corporate integrity. For the last 2 decades, so actually over 20 years, the National Opinion Research Center has released data stating that approximately 2/3 of Americans believe that most people cannot be trusted. Now, while all that's going on, for many, the church is no longer a priority, a source of meaning and commitment and direction in life. The reality that we all know of God's transforming love in Jesus Christ is often perceived at best as one option on many paths to success and salvation. So we might start asking, where is God in all of this? And how might we be able to see God in new ways, with new eyes that might reach such a pessimistic and skeptical world? Now, emojis are really nothing new. We have chrismons on our Christmas tree that remind us of the symbols of Christmas and Advent from a Christian perspective. Icons have been used in church paintings for centuries, and these images, such as the righteous branch, go back thousands of years. In the Eastern tradition of the church, icons have actually been called windows into heaven. So symbols, which are ancient emojis, so to speak, have long been powerful for us as people of faith. And so we know that if we see the fish symbol or the cross, those are images that have emerged in many forms and continue to be popular today and speak to us of things without ever being said. Many of you might know, but Christians in the midst of the persecution of Rome, remember, nothing was paved, everything was dirt and sand. And so they would walk up to somebody that they weren't sure about in the street, and they, with their walking stick, would make that sign of the fish. And if people People who would know what that meant, they knew it was safe to talk about it. But if not, I'm guessing they sort of scuffed over it with their foot. But emojis, symbols, icons, those have long been ways that we have communicated our faith. And so we go back to 600 years before the birth of Jesus, when the prophet Jeremiah spoke of the restoration of Jerusalem and its leaders. The days are surely coming, said the Lord through the prophet, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And in those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David. And there it is, God's emoji, a righteous branch springing up for King David. He shall execute justice and righteousness in the land, God says, and in those days, Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will live in safety, and this is the name by which it will be called. The Lord is our righteousness. Now, in the 33rd chapter of Jeremiah, which is where our reading came from today, Jeremiah's world is in a state of collapse. Jeremiah himself is in prison for preaching that God was going to deliver Israel into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar for their failure to keep the covenant with Yahweh. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Jerusalem desperately attempt to protect themselves from Nebuchadnezzar's inevitable invasion. And so Jeremiah in the past has talked about plucking up and tearing down. And so in an ironic reflection of those words, the inhabitants of Jerusalem actually tear down their own houses in a vain attempt to save the city. In effect, they say they are destroying the city in order to save it. Now, God's message to Jeremiah concerns this particular people at that particular moment. But friends, I have to say, it sounds eerily familiar. Things being torn down in order to save, things being stopped in order to produce, things being thrown away in order to produce. It's as if we are reinventing the Advent message for this first Sunday in Advent. But hidden within those desperate events is God's abiding faithfulness to Israel. Because God is already to provide this righteous branch, a descendant of David, so that Jerusalem and Judah will be restored. We know that this branch is to emerge out of the tree of King David, the greatest of Israel's king, the one despite all of his flaws, who is a man after God's own heart. And with his focus on justice and righteousness, this leader would truly restore the fortunes of the people. Bible scholar Patrick Miller says that his focus would not be simply on abundance, productivity, and partying, but instead will rightly render the affairs of the people and will lead them in their worship of the Lord. And this new leader, according to Christians, is Jesus Christ, born into the house and family of David. He is the one who teaches us righteousness, a word that is best defined as right relationship. So Jesus desires that we show justice and righteousness in our relationships to each other and in our relationship to God, and his whole life models what that looks like. So how do we apply this message of righteousness to our lives as we follow him into the future and we strive to lead others to Christ? As I mentioned, righteousness is all about right relationship. It's not being better than someone else. It's not being self-righteous, but to be in right relationship with the people around us. And to do that, we search for the image of God in each and every person. Black and white, rich, poor, young, old, male, female, anything in between, immigrant and native born, we act as though Jesus is hidden inside the least of our brothers and sisters, because we remember that Jesus said, We are really serving him when? When we give food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, welcome to the stranger, and clothing to the naked. And maybe one of the reasons that Jesus came into this world as a weak and vulnerable baby was to remind us of the importance of caring for the least of our brothers and sisters. Right relationship is treating others as you would like to be treated. And I just ask, is there something that you said or thought this week that you would absolutely hate it if somebody else said it or thought it about you? As Jesus grew up to say later in his Sermon on the Mount, in everything is a big word, in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you. This is the law and the prophets. In this single verse, Jesus offers us a sort of emoji that shows us what it means to execute justice and righteousness in the land. And then there's this divine dimension to righteousness. Because being in right relationship with God doesn't mean just going to worship and giving offerings, because we know that those self-righteous Pharisees, they were very good at doing just that. Instead, it means paying attention to the weightier matters of the law, says Jesus, justice and mercy and faith. It means practicing the kind of religion that James says is pure and undefiled before God, a religion that challenges people to care for the orphans and widows in their distress and to keep one unstained from the world. Many of you might remember when Bishop Michael Curry, the Episcopal prelate, preached at the royal wedding a few years ago. He could have offered a really great, sweet, and sentimental, typical wedding kind of a sermon, but he surprised everyone by giving a message on civil rights and social justice in the name of our loving, liberating, and self-giving God. Yes, he talked about love, but also about executing justice and righteousness in the land. So in front of the royal family and an international audience, he lifted up God's emoji, the righteous branch. When love is the way, said Bishop Curry, then no child will go to bed hungry in this world ever again. When love is the way, we will let justice roll down like a mighty stream and righteousness like an ever-flowing brook. When love is the way, poverty will become history. When love is the way, the earth will be a sanctuary. When love is the way, we will lay down our sword and shields down by the riverside to study war no more. When love is the way, there is plenty of good room for all of God's children. You see, Bishop Curry was challenging us to follow Jesus, this late leader raised up from God. And with his righteous branch as a central symbol for our lives, we discover what it means to be right with each other and right with God. Marguerite Higgins was a correspondent during the Korean conflict, and one bitter winter's day, she began interviewing a muddy Marine who had just returned from a grueling battle. As he opened a tin can of sea rations, I do understand the food has gotten a lot better these days, and began eating, Higgins said to the young man, "If I could give you anything in the world you wanted, what would you ask for?" What would you ask for? The Marine thought for a moment and then said, "Give me tomorrow." We're at the beginning of the Advent season. in which we are reminded again and again, the days are here, the promise has been fulfilled, the righteous branch of David's line has come, is coming, and will come again. The Lord is indeed our righteousness, and our righteousness, our right relationship with God, does not depend solely on our own actions. Our right relationship with God does not depend on planning a wonderful Christmas program, or preparing a magnificent meal, or singing a super anthem, or giving the perfect gift, or even designing the prize-winning outdoor light system. Our relationship with God depends solely on the truly perfect gift of love that God has already given, God's only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. Friends, we are all too well aware that our own efforts often end in discouragement, because expecting perfection and everything to go exactly as we plan usually results in us experiencing some sort of rejection. And so the weeks before Christmas bring us to the same place again and again. And we find ourselves saying, everything will be all right if only they would, or if only I could, or if only God would. If they would only rebuild the temple, if only they would work harder on the city walls, if only God would just take charge. And maybe some similar thoughts are whirling around in your own mind as you begin this season of preparation for the birth of the Christ child. Many people have already begun the countdown to Christmas. Anyone have an Advent calendar? Okay. Calendars are already jammed with congregational celebrations and social events and friends and family. You've got weekend meals on the calendar, and gets to the point where it seems like there are just simply not enough hours in the day to accomplish all of the countless tasks that loom before us during the next few weeks. And our minds can spin out of control as we plan for happiness, but often experience frustration. If only, we think, if only God would just take charge. A neighbor tells this story. Her two small sons came bursting into the house shouting that their little sister had fallen into the pond at the back of their property. Now, being an experienced mother, she had learned to ask questions before going into a full-blown panic. Then what happened? She asked. Well, we tried giving her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, her oldest son replied. Yeah, said the younger boy, but she kept getting up and running away. And that's precisely what happens when we try to be in complete charge of our own lives. Our anticipations and expectations keep getting up and running away from us no matter how much we try to control them. And our desperate plans for the ideal holiday season, which, by the way, simply does not exist, rarely brings the happiness and satisfaction that we had intended. Instead, the results can often feel more like emptiness and frustration, and instead of being able to enjoy the good things that are happening all around us, we focus on those few things that have fallen through. Friends, today is the first Sunday of Advent, not the first Sunday of a reckless countdown of shopping days until Christmas. So what preparations for the coming Christ child are happening in the depth of your soul? How much time and energy are you giving to the trimmings and frills of Christmas? And then how does that compare with the time and energy you're investing in beginning and continuing a right relationship with God? The days have come. The promise has been fulfilled. A righteous branch, Jesus the Christ, has come, is coming, and will come again. And so I love the words of the psalmist. Make your ways known to me, Lord, and teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth. Teach it to me, because you are the God who saves me. And I put my hope in you all day long. Amen.